Welcome, friends, to this new lecture of soil science and technology. And we'll start from the slides where we left in the last lecture. And we are discussing about different volume, different qualitative the different moisture content of the soil and how we can term them. We talked about fill capacity, we talked about permanent wilting point, we talked about hygroscopic coefficient, what is available water content, plant available water content, what is unavailable water, what is gravitational water, and then we discussed what are the factors which affects this available water content in the soil. So we talked about soil texture. So now we shall start about we shall also talk about some other factors, and then we'll move to our next topic. So you can see that also in this picture we can see the different the effect of soil texture in the volumetric soil water content. And obviously in case of clay soils, where they are frequently provide less available water than do well granulated silt loams, since the clay tends to have a higher wilting coefficient. We have already talked about it in the last lecture. So as you can see, obviously as we are going from sand to sandy loam to loamy soil to silt loam, there is a continuous increase in soil water volumetric soil water content, ultimately it levels off, and obviously the wilting coefficient also increases and it reaches maximum in case of clay soil because of high moisture retentive capacity of the clay soil in their macropores. So obviously the difference between this fill capacity and wilting point here at clay soil is smaller than this silty loam soil. So obviously the silty loam soil will have more available water content than that of the clay soil. However, also well granulated soil will have higher well granulated silty loam will have higher moisture content, available water content than that of clay soils. So soil organic matter, it is also very important. Soil organic matter exerts both direct and indirect influences that contribute increased soil water availability, because in case of direct effect, it high water holding capacity, volumetric water holding capacity of organic matter also adds to the water content of the soil. So when we add organic matter from outside to the soil, obviously its total water holding capacity increases. And also indirectly, when we apply soil water holding soil organic matter into the soil, it helps in binding the soil particles, improving the soil structure. When it improves the soil structure, a well aggregated soil, obviously it will increase the water holding capacity. So as a whole, the water holding application of organic matter seems to increase the water holding capacity or the available water content of the soil. So obviously in this slide it is also clear that as we increase the percent of soil organic matter by weight and soil water content, and what is the relationship with the soil water content. So you will see that as the percentage of organic matter is increases, the differences between fill capacity and permanent wilting point continuously increasing, and as a result of that, the plant available water or the available water content increases by addition of organic matter. Uh, the finally we shall talk we should talk about the compaction effect, which is very important. Remember that when we compact the soil, obviously it reduces the amount of water that plants can take off by crushing the macropores into micropores, and also when we do the compaction, ultimately it increases the bulk density. So when there is a high bulk density, it always limits the root penetration, and finally when we increase the bulk density, it decreases the total pore space. So by these three different ways, compaction can harm the the water holding capacity of the soil, and obviously it limits higher compaction always limits the water infiltration into the soil and water movement into the soil. So friends, we have finally finished this topic of uh, qualitative moisture, and then qualitative moisture, different moisture content of the soils and their qualitative terms. And so I hope that you have learned something new, and let us move to our next topic, that is the soil air. The soil air is very much important. Soil air, or the process is called the soil aeration. Soil aeration is very much important, and it is basically the exchange of water and water and carbon dioxide between the atmospheric air and the soil air. So, soil aeration facilitates the exchange of gases between the soil and atmosphere. As we can see, the oxygen is getting entered into the soil and carbon dioxide is getting it is released from the soil to the atmospheric air. So, this interchange or this exchange of air between the soil and atmosphere is called the soil aeration. So, soil aeration, in case of soil aeration, the oxygen availability in soil is basically determined by three factors. One is macroporosity, second is oxygen consumption by organisms, and thirdly and most importantly, that is soil water content. Now, you can see that in case of porous, and there are three different conditions. One is porous and permeable condition, and is porous and non-permeable condition, and non-porous and non-permeable condition. So, obviously, in this case, in the porous and permeable condition, there are interconnected pore space. However, in case of porous non-permeable, there are non-interconnected pore space, and in the third condition, that is non-porous and non-permeable, there is no pore space. So, obviously, in the first condition here, there will be more oxygen availability and there will be more gaseous exchange. Second is important is oxygen consumption by organisms. Now, you know that plant roots also does respiration, and as a result of respiration it consumes the oxygen and releases carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide increases its partial pressure into the soil air. We will discuss that later on. So, oxygen consumption by organism is very much important for oxygen availability in the soil air. And finally, soil water content. Obviously, the soil water content, you will see in this graph, obviously we can see the relationship between oxygen in soil air and soil depth, and obviously you can see the differences between the oxygen in soil air before heavy rains and after heavy rains. Obviously, before heavy rains there will be higher amount of oxygen, whereas after heavy rain there will be lower amount of oxygen, because filling of the pore spaces by water, removing the air. So, this is the difference between before and after heavy rains, and these differences is maximum at the at the upper layer of the surface. As you can see, there is a the change in oxygen in the soil layer is drastic in the upper layer of the soil just after a heavy rainfall. So, another important term, another important is function is soil water content for oxygen availability. As you can see here, these are individual soil aggregates which are covered by the thick films of water, and these thick films of water creates some anaerobic zone, and as a result of this anaerobic zone and thick water film, the air cannot diffuse from the atmospheric air to the soil air, because diffusion of air through the water is 10,000 times slower than that of diffusion through air. So, as a result of if the soil has got more interconnected macropores, the air will or oxygen will diffuse into the soil atmosphere more readily than that of when water is present, because what you do through the water medium, oxygen diffuses very slowly. So, we know what is the implication of water content for soil aeration, or the water or the oxygen content of the soil. Now let us see what is the effect of the if there is an excess moisture. Obviously, when there is an excess moisture, the all the pore space will be filled by the water, and leaving no air filled pores, and as a result of that, some plants are very much sensitive to this condition. So as you can see, some plants dry out permanently and some plants damages permanently. However, having said this, there are some plants which have made their own physiological adaptation for this waterlogging condition. So when there is a flooded water over the soil surface, we call it waterlogging condition, and in waterlogging condition, some plants, especially you will see the mangroves, will grow because they have made some uh, own physiological modification. First of the one of the physiological modification they have made is called parenchyma, which are basically cells which supply the oxygen to roots from the atmosphere. Some hollow parenchyma structure, and then hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are the plants which are adapted to grow in waterlogged condition, and they have above water roots to supply their oxygen. So as a result, they can survive in this waterlogging condition. Especially you will see this type of plant or hydrophytes present in mangrove forests. This type of adaptation plant has made for dealing with poor aeration condition into the soil. So, what are the different processes of gaseous exchange? Well, there are two major processes of gaseous exchange. One is called mass flow, another is called diffusion. Now, mass flow is always caused by fluctuation of soil moisture content that force air in or air out. So, I mean, when the mass flow basically occurs through the fluctuation of soil moisture. For example, before rainfall, after a heavy rainfall, water enters into the soil and removes the air. So this is a called mass flow of water from as a result of rainfall. However, in diffusion, movement of gas and its direction is governed by partial pressure of the gas. This is very important. Partial pressure. Now, partial pressure, what is partial pressure? Partial pressure is the pressure exerted by an individual gas in a mixture of gases. So, if you can see this picture shows how diffusion takes place within the soil and atmosphere. So, if this is a soil surface and soil pores, if this is an atmosphere, these are the soil pores. Obviously, these hollow these are the oxide molecules, and these solid spheres are the carbon dioxide molecules. As you can see, the proportion of carbon dioxide is quite high in the soil air as compared to atmosphere, and it is the opposite trend can be found for oxygen, and it is very expected. Why? Because in soil air millions of microorganisms are present. In the millions of microorganisms undergoes respiration, and as a result of respiration they consume these oxygen molecules and they produce these carbon dioxide molecules, and as a result of that, the partial pressure, or I would say the proportion of carbon dioxide is quite higher in the soil air as compared to atmospheric air. And as oxygen is being consumed by the macroorganisms like or aerobic organisms like the plant roots and other aerobic organisms, obviously the proportion of oxygen is lower in soil air as compared to atmospheric air. So, obviously you can see the proportion of these two gases are different in different condition, and as a result their partial pressure will also vary, and as a result of changes in partial pressure, obviously you will see the partial pressure of carbon dioxide will be quite high in case of soil air than that of atmospheric air, and as a result of this partial pressure gradient the carbon dioxide will diffuse away into atmospheric air, and in case of oxygen this trend is opposite, because the partial pressure of oxygen in atmospheric air is higher than that of partial pressure of oxygen in soil air, and as a result oxygen will diffuse inside the soil. So, this is called partial pressure gradient, and this partial pressure gradient is the force that drives the gases to be diffused away from atmospheric air to soil air and soil air to atmospheric air. So, how we express partial pressure? Well, let us see an example of partial pressure of oxygen. So, if we consider, let us assume that a air pressure is basically 100 kilopascal or 1 atmosphere, and the concentration of oxygen in air, or we will talk about the atmospheric air, is around 21% or volumetrically we can say 0.21 liter per liter by volume. So, the partial pressure of oxygen will be 21 kilopascal. So, you can see that this is how we calculate the partial pressure of a particular gas in a gaseous mixture. So, how we can characterize soil aeration? The characterization of the soil aeration, we can first let us see what is the gaseous composition of soil air. Well, the soil air composed of various gases, and soil air has the same amount of nitrogen, which is around 78% in the atmosphere. So, both soil air and atmospheric air has similar amount of oxygen, that is 78%, and oxygen is somewhat less, it is generally less than 20% or almost 20% in soil than atmosphere. In case of atmosphere it is around 21%. So, as a result the partial pressure of oxygen in atmospheric air is higher than that of partial pressure of oxygen in soil air, and carbon dioxide is more in soil. Remember that this is this is the major difference between soil air and atmospheric air. In case of soil air, the carbon dioxide is more, that is 0.35%, which is 10 times more concentrated than atmosphere. In case of atmosphere, you will see the concentration of carbon dioxide is around 0.03%. So, we are getting 10 times higher, though the absolute quantity is not so high, but if we consider the relative change between the soil air and atmospheric air, the concentration of carbon dioxide changes tenfolds, and this concentration change is mainly responsible, this concentration change of carbon dioxide in the soil air basically results from high amount of respiration activities by different macrofauna, macroflora and microflora which are aerobic in nature. And lack of oxygen obviously causes anaerobic condition, and under such condition concentration of methane, hydrogen sulfide and this ethylene, all these gases increases. So, so the gaseous composition, now you have a basic idea about the gaseous composition of soil air and how it differs from atmospheric air. So, gaseous composition of soil air, and secondly the air film porosity is also important. As I have told you that just after the heavy rainfall, the water enters into the soil and drives back all the air from the pore spaces, and as a result the water filled pore spaces increases and air filled pore spaces decreases, and air filled pore spaces are better for aeration because it helps in oxygen diffusion, In case of water-filled or water-filled pore spaces, there is no good aeration, and obviously oxygen diffuses, because oxygen diffuses 10,000 times lower through water filled pores than in the air filled pores. And let us see another very important term, that is oxidation reduction potential or redox potential. Now, redox potential basically shows the tendency or potential for electrons to be transferred from one substance to another substance, and this redox potential we generally term in terms of EH. So, this redox potential generally it is, in case of, there should be a reference. So, in case of higher redox potential, obviously there is a oxidized condition, and lower redox potential generally indicates the reduced condition. So, there should be some reference. So, in this case hydrogen, obviously the redox potential 1, and redox potential basically determines which compound is present in the soil at a particular time and its concentration and oxidation step. So, we will see that later on to the next slide probably. Yes. So, redox potential. So, living organism basically releases they basically release electrons while oxidizing carbon for energy. So, in the soil obviously there are some organic carbons, organic matter, and organic matter contain huge amount of organic carbon. So, this living organism releases electrons while oxidizing carbon and energy, and this electron is accepted by oxygen. So, oxygen acts as an acceptor of electrons. So, it is, or in other words, it is an oxidizing agent. So, once all oxygen is depleted by this process, anaerobic zones is created. So, let us see an example. So, if we go back and see an example, obviously if you see this iron oxide, where the oxidation number of iron is +2, when it reacts with water, it oxidizes to form this FeOH and these electrons, and these electrons is basically being absorbed or being accepted by this oxygen, which is further reduced into water. We will see that later on. So, as the reaction proceeds to the right, each Fe2 loses an electron, as you can see here, and becomes an Fe3 and forms H plus ion by hydrolyzing the H2O, and these H plus ion lowers the pH of the soil. And when the reaction proceeds to the left, this FeOH acts as an electron acceptor and the pH rises as H plus ion are consumed, because it is a, you can see the reaction can go in both directions, and the tendency or potential of electrons to be transferred from one substance to another in such reaction is termed as redox potential or EH. And basically we measure EH by platinum electrode, which is attached to a millivolt meter, and generally redox is calculated in terms of millivolt or volt. So, living organism, as later we know that living organism releases electrons while oxidizing carbon for energy, and this oxygen acts as an acceptor of this electron, or in other words oxidizing agent, and in terms this oxygen get reduced, and once all the oxygen reduced by this process, anaerobic zone created. So, this oxygen acts as a oxidizing agent, accepting electrons, which is related which is released by this living organism by oxidizing carbon for energy, ultimately produces the water. So, oxygen basically reduced to water, while FeO oxidized to FeOOH. So, if we combine both two reaction, we will get overall effect of oxidation reduction. Ultimately, we will get the FeO will produce FeOH. So, this is an example where oxidation reduction potential plays a significant role, and it basically basically indicates the oxidation reduction of of some different substances. So, what are the different values of oxidation reduction potential? So, in a well aerated soil where plenty of gases of oxygen present, the EH is the range of 0.4 to 0.7 volt. and as aeration is reduced and gaseous oxygen is depleted, the EH declines to about 0.3 to 0.35 volt, and if organic matter rich soils are flooded under one condition, EH values as low as minus 0.3 volt can be reduced. And remember that when there is a high amount of organic matter present in a flooded condition, all the, remember in the flood, so in flooded condition, all the air's pores will be occupied by water. So there will be no oxygen available for aerobic organisms to further oxidize this carbon. So these anaerobic or facultative anaerobic organisms will further act in this condition, and these organisms will use some other compound like nitrate, sulfate as a terminal at the electron acceptor instead of oxygen. And as a result of using those nitrates, sulfates and all these different molecules as electron acceptor, they will create a reduced condition or anaerobic condition, and in the anaerobic condition you will see that the EH will reduce to negative, that is minus 0.3 volt. So, different types of anaerobic reaction occurs, and as a result of anaerobic reaction in the waterlogged soil, methane and other gases are formed. So, this slide basically shows the relationship between the days of wet soil permitted to dry, days a wet soil permitted to dry and oxidized soil layer. So, as you can see, after a wet soil, that is a saturated soil, we allow it to dry. After passing of couple of days, the redox potential increases because oxygen will enter into the pore spaces from which the water get evaporated, and obviously, as you can see from this curve, and as a result of that, redox potential increases simultaneously. So, increase of redox potential indicates oxidation, decrease of redox potential indicates reduction condition. Now, this graph basically shows the relative order of reduction in redox condition. You can see we have presented here the relationship between pH and redox potential, and obviously, when the reduction will start, obviously it will say, it will tell us in which order the different components which are present into the soil will undergo reduction. Now, you can see in all this reaction, the reaction can go in both direction. So, in the right side, obviously the reduced state, and the left side, that is the oxidized stage. So, as the redox potential goes down, obviously oxygen will be reduced to water, followed by nitrate will be reduced to nitrogen, gaseous nitrogen, manganese dioxide will reduce to Mn2 plus, and ferric hydroxide will reduce to Fe2 plus, and so on so forth, and ultimately you will see that formation of methane is there. So, that is why the waterlogged condition, as reduction is going on, ultimately there will be release of methane. So, these chart or these graph basically shows us the order through which the different different component of a soil will undergo reduction, and obviously you remember that the reaction always occur from top to bottom. So, if we consider what pH 7, if we consider while at pH 6.5, obviously the nitrate will undergo reduction to nitrogen first, and followed by MnO2 to Mn2 plus, and this as basically shows the same thing, and this also shows the changes in EH when one oxygen is converted to its reduced form, nitrogen is converted to its reduced form, that is nitrate to elemental nitrogen, Mn4 plus to Mn2 plus, Fe3 plus to Fe2 plus, sulfate to H2S and carbon dioxide to methane. So, all these are reduction processes, and you can see the EH is continuously growing down and ultimately reaches negative where there is a high anaerobic condition. So, this is also a called Winogradsky column, and this Winogradsky column is basically shows a clear division between oxidized zone, which you can see here at the bottom, at the top, and at the bottom there will be reduced zone. So, basically this in the Winogradsky column we generally insert mud and mixed with different organic matter and then put some water, and as a result a iron wire iron wire can be inserted here to show to show different changes due to the oxidation reduction. As you can see, as at the top oxidized zone can be formed, however at the bottom there will be reduced zone. So, here iron is we are using iron wire. So, at the bottom you can see it is producing the iron sulphide due to reduction condition, ultimately producing the black color. However, at the top it is oxidized and producing this red color or orange color zone. So, so, what are the factors which affect soil aeration? There are several factors which affect soil aeration. First of all, drainage of excess water. So, drainage of gravitational water out of the profile and concomitant diffusion into the air into the soil takes place most readily in macropores, you know that, and it is basically dependent on soil texture, bulk density and organic matter content. Rates of respiration into the soil, because it depends on organic matter content, and more organic matter will be there and more microbes will use them and releases gases into the soil. So, more organic matter, more microbes will use and release more gases. So, rate of respiration will also affect the soil aeration. Soil profile, as you can see, oxygen tends to decrease with depth and carbon dioxide tends to increase with the depth, and also soil heterogeneity takes part in in soil aeration. Obviously, in case of long term tillage reduces the aeration, and clay soil has less aeration, and obviously remember that the entrapped zones have most aeration than within the pads. And seasonal differences also influences the aeration status. Obviously, poor aeration you can see in the wet season, because all the pore spaces will be filled by water. So, aeration or water or air movement will be slowed down. Effect of vegetation, obviously vegetation transpires to the stomata and lowers the groundwater table, and further as a result of this transpiration it improves the aeration, because they are removing the water from the soil, creating more pore spaces which can be occupied by air. And also there are some ecological effects of soil aeration, but let us wrap up here. We will start from here in the next lecture, and we will try to finish this topic and then we will move to a new topic. But I hope that you have learned something new in this lecture, and if you have any question, feel free to email and feel free to ask me any question. So, let us meet in the next lecture with more discussion in soil aeration, as well as we will start a new topic, that is soil temperature. Till then, thank you and goodbye.